All right, so we're going to look at Project 6, which was dealing with the Bezold effect and color, pattern, and texture. Pattern being one of the oldest forms of design, and every culture has pattern tradition. And pattern, of course, occurs with repetition of elements. And pattern inherently, visual pattern and physical pattern, tactile pattern, have repetition. Some patterns are very ordered, some are much more random in structure, but they all have a structure. So our problem was to deal with pattern and deal with rhythm, a progressive rhythm, because once you have pattern, you automatically create rhythm. So pattern, texture, rhythm all merge together and work concurrently because they're all inherent in the idea of repetition of elements or a repetition of similar elements. So we were to take a structured grid-based pattern that can include shapes and lines, or just shapes, or just lines, that collectively contributed to an overall visual texture, which means there was a sense of surface visually. And through change over the distance of the design expresses progressive rhythm. That means that the pattern changes throughout the design. And you were to create the pattern and then do a repeat of it. So you would have two designs. In each one you could use 3 colors. Establish the colors in the first one, and then in the second one use the same colors but change one. So a total of 4 colors within the overall design. And the idea was to keep everything the same except to change out one color. Don't change out 2 or all 3 colors. Don't switch colors around. Just change out one color to look at what the visual effect is going to be. And you had to deal with a golden rectangle as a size, a proportion. And you had to deal with the golden rectangle as the proportional understanding of your design space and based off an 8-inch square. You could make it horizontal or vertical. You could make it horizontal or vertical in orientation. You had all the color in the world available to you, and you could do this by hand and also digitally. And a few of you did it digitally, most of you did it by hand, which is fine. So the key elements here are structured, grid-based pattern. So we're basically looking for an informal or formal structure underneath your pattern. And with pattern, if you don't consider structure, there's a lot of weakness in the result. And as of this recording, I have not looked at the journals, so I have not seen the preliminary work yet. So we're basically just flying blind here. So let's take a look. Remember that the Bezold effect is a visual phenomenon where when you change out one color in a design, the entire design changes. And depending upon the color that you change, the design will be drastically different. So what we're looking for here is that color change. We're also looking for the structure of the design and what colors you used. And I believe there was a key component of this in that you were to draw from nature. You were to go out with your camera, taking a walk or taking a drive and taking photos of patterns found in nature. And those photos would inform your design decisions, your pattern, as well as the colors that you use. So this should have been a fun assignment. Get you outdoors and get you looking at things differently. Get you looking at the natural world perhaps differently than you normally do. And utilizing what's all around you to inspire a design decision. And hopefully this has been your best work to date in the class. So here we have a formal structure, and the structure is actually active in the design because we can pretty much see the edges of it. The linear elements that are utilized in the design follow a very ordered, very methodical, precise structure, a grid. And the grid changes. It's narrower in the center and then larger on the ends, on the sides. Start with a square here and go to a skinny rectangle and go back out again. There's a sense of layering. The red bars, the red lines, seem to be forward of the green, which is forward of the yellow-green. And then the color change here is to what appears to be a red-violet. That is, yep, it's red-violet that is toned. There's a lot of gray in that. So we go from a very vibrant red, very saturated, to a toned, very subdued red-violet. This is very active. This becomes a lot more passive. We go from darker, the red is darker, to lighter. The toned red-violet is lighter than the red. So there's a huge difference in personality between the two designs. Be interesting to see what would happen if the red-violet were actually a different color choice. So in the top design with the red, there is more energy. In the bottom design, it's a lot more passive because the red-violet is very quiet, it's toned, it's desaturated. So we've got the structure, we've got 4 colors total, the green, the yellow-green, the red, and the red-violet. And if anything were to change, smaller shapes and more. And that will create a greater sense of visual texture. We're not quite there on the texture idea yet in terms of a sense of tactile quality that we can actually see visually. Things are too large within the design space, given the proportion of the design space and the scale of the elements. There's not enough of them to start really creating a sense of texture. The effect, the Bezold effect, is working on this. We've got the cyan blue and a shaded green. Looks almost like a viridian or a vermilion. And then we have what looks like a shaded yellow, meaning that there's black added here, and then the more vivid yellow here. And the design looks very different. These start popping forward. The light blue linear elements are popping forward. The blue here looks very dark. The green looks a lot darker than it does here. It's a good study in color interaction, color relativity. What we don't have here is a sense of surface pattern. We're reading very strongly figure ground. And there's a lot of negative space. And we don't have a frequency, we don't have a progression, a rate of change of progressive rhythm. We have metric rhythm, but there is no change. There is no increase in speed, decrease in speed of the rhythm. The cadence of the rhythm doesn't change. So we're missing that pattern component, we're missing that rhythm component that should happen in this. It is structured. There is a sense of actually breaking up the space compositionally based on the divisions of the golden mean, the golden rectangle. And that is an okay choice. You could choose to do that or not. But we don't have enough frequency to really create pattern. We're reading this as an object on a background. And then part of an object. Looks like the object is repeating, but it would be really great if these devices, these, we'll just call them the lollipops, if they were probably maybe a fifth or a sixth of the size they actually are, and then repeated over and over again through the design space. The presentation here, I mean, there's some issues right there with the cutting. There's some issues with the curling on the paper and so forth. There's a drop shadow there which says that the edges of the designs are not adhered to the surface of the paper really well. In terms of presentation, this could be a lot more clean. It could be a lot more polished. A lot more care could be taken with the overall presentation. And the reason we want to care about presentation at this point is because this is where we learn how to present things, to sell ideas, to help build trust, to communicate expertise, to communicate an attention to detail, to communicate a professionalism. So with this, we have basically a radial structure, and it is small in the center and then larger on the perimeter. And we're getting a sense of texture here. Things are fairly small, and there's a frequency that's going on in here, so we're starting to get a feel of surface. And then as we get larger, where we only have 2 or 3 of the, we'll call them the blades of the succulent, it does become more figure ground oriented over here. And we, because things are so large within the design space and so few, we don't have the frequency, therefore we don't have that sense of visual texture as much. But we do start it here. So there are 3 colors. There's the yellow, there's the tinted green, and then there's the other tinted green. So 2 tints of green and the yellow. And the yellow is warm, and of course the green is a cool hue. And then over here we've changed out the light green for the red, and the red is fairly saturated, might even have a little bit of black in it. At least it's looking a little bit dark on my display. And it's interesting to see how the yellow really warms up against the red. It's kind of interesting that it does that. And then the green actually looks a lot lighter here than it does over here. So definitely a very different sense. This has a lot more energy. It's a lot more active. It is, as we said, structurally based. It's a radiation structure. So there is a progression from smaller to larger. There seems to be a directional change as well. So this is expressing the Bezold effect fairly well. It's a strikingly different sense of the design. 2 different colorways, using between them 4 different colors. This is a digital solution, and there is a sense of texture in the frequency and the repetition of the smaller elements. There's a sense of texture in the repetition of the linear elements. Both designs use the same 3 colors, and they just have been switched out. So here we have the magenta in the background, and then the light blue in the foreground, and here we have the dark blue in the background, the magenta in the foreground. The idea was to change only one color, and so whether it's the blue or the magenta or the light blue, only one color should be changed. All 3 colors were actually changed, even though they use the same colors as the first colorway. The colors have been reassigned, and so it's stepping out of bounds of the design requirements and not solving the problem, so that we could see a very strong distinction. The Bezold effect is still in effect within the fact that the 3 colors have been reassigned. But we're not using 4 colors between the 2 designs, we're only using 3. There is a sense of structure. Probably the rate of change could have been resolved. There is a sense of kind of almost a perspective angle. And this comes straight down, but this is closer, this is farther away, this is farther away, it's closer over here. And then this is kind of flat, but these are larger, they're closer. These are smaller intervals, they're farther away. Things become less frequent, a lot more negative space between the spirals as we move back into space, or that sense of being moving back into space. And then more frequency as we come forward. So in terms of the structure, if we are looking at how these things are lined up, and they're actually not lined up in a solidly orderly fashion. So you can see there's, if we take the centers of the spirals, they bounce all over the place in relationship to the grid line. So it could have been a little more precise, and given the fact that this was done digitally, the medium, it was done in a digital medium, it was done in software, it should have been more precise. Okay, this one, the Bezold effect, is going from the yellow and changing out to, again, what appears to be a toned red-violet. And so the red-violet is very desaturated. And this looks to be a yellow-orange that is shaded. And then we have the tinted green background. The Bezold effect is working. The thing that's not really working is that there's not a real strong sense of structure. Things seem kind of randomly placed. There's a sense, perhaps, of a radial structure. The shapes, the scale, the placement, the amount of negative space between everything, the fact that some are touching and some are not, and there's some awkward overlaps, like this is just really not working well. Like this area right here is not working well. It's just kind of an awkward moment. The placement of things indicates that there is a lack of structure because things are just kind of thrown. It's like looking into a junk drawer. And rather than having things ordered, even in an informal sense, it is hard to understand what is going on. Say we divide the space in the design in half, which is about there. And then where do we go? Where are our grid marks? Well, let's see. Let's just put them every inch for just general purposes. So how are the shapes relating to an underlying structure? They're really not. The design then becomes weak and disorderly, and that's the main issue. The eye doesn't know where to land. It has a sense of confusion to it. It's not really chaotic, but there's a lot of questionable things going on. The variety of shapes, the placement of shapes, the relation of shapes to shapes. Generally, they're small enough in scale to be frequent enough to start creating a pattern and a visual texture that makes sense, but nothing is placed or positioned in relationship to anything else. So this is really weak on the design aspect. It solves the Bezold problem, but it doesn't, since this is color, pattern, and texture, it solves the color. It doesn't solve the texture or the pattern aspect of the assignment. Okay, this doesn't have enough frequency, and the shapes are way too large. We are getting a sense of pattern, part of a larger pattern, and between the two we're getting a sense of almost a continuation. We've got that implied line thing going on. But the shapes are just way too large. They definitely look like they're derived from natural form, which is great, because like this one, we're not sure what the inspiration is for that and where the colors came from, if they came from. So with this, we definitely have the natural form sensibility and the abstraction of that, and that's working very nicely. There's a sense of informal structure, so not mathematically precise, but there's too few elements to start creating any sort of visual texture. Things are just too large, and also the color change from the blue-green tint to is not enough of a change to really elicit that much of a difference. And let me show you what I mean. Let's just take this into grayscale. We'll discard the color, and do you see any difference in the design? We can see the centers a little more clearly here, but we can't really see them there. But really, there's no difference. The light value is the same, the darker values are the same. So in terms of changing out to create the Bezold effect, the color options, the color possibilities to really create a dramatic difference in the design has not been explored. It does change. The one on the right is a little bit less active than the one on the left. The one on the left, because of the blue-green being more saturated, and because it's opposite of the orange, it's on the other side of the hue circle from the orange, it has a little more energy on the left. The assignment does not capitalize on the phenomenon of the Bezold effect. This is a radiation structure. It has a sense of, we can look at this and see an organic origin of this. It's utilizing a lot of movement. It's utilizing a spiral. We're going from the ochre, looks like a yellow-orange, so let's take a look at that. Yeah, that's a yellow-orange that is toned. Actually, it's neutralized, very neutral. So we have a kind of a rich, kind of a curry color here, and we have the two reds, actually the shaded red, and then looks like the tinted red-orange. And there's less value differences here than there are here. So we've taken that yellow-orange and turned it into yellow here, very bright, very saturated yellow. Yellow, of course, is lighter, and so we have more value difference, more light-dark difference going on in the lower one. And so this becomes much more energetic. This is a little more subdued. It has a sense of being farther away, but the yellow in this brings everything right up, kind of close. It's in our face. And there is enough frequency for the most part to start creating a sense of texture in various parts. So kind of more around in here and in here. Less textural effect going on over in here. But definitely following this around, we get a really strong sense of pattern and that sense of rhythm and cadence. The progression on this works really well. We go from smaller to larger in all cases to varying degrees. So overall, this is a good solution, exploring color and design in a very interesting way. And then this is a digital solution. And again, definitely we can see nature as an inspiration, and it is abstracted to a great degree. And it appears that the background has been changed out. And so what we want to look at then is this appearing so red, which is right there, and they seem to be the same color because this is not changing. So I'm sampling here, and I'm sampling here, and nothing's changing. So the change in value in the background is what's making these discs look really light because the background's dark. And then this with the warm yellow is making the same color look that dark. And then these look dark and these look light. So by changing the background, in this case, the we'll call it the base color, there is a dramatic difference between the two. The one on the left seems farther away, a little more reserved, a little more quiet. The one on the right has more value contrast. There's a lot more energy to the one on the right. So the Bezold effect is accomplished very well in this. And it's a fairly simple design. It is a formal structure, definitely structured. So there is control of the design all the way through. and there's a progressive rhythm. Things change. We go from less negative space to more negative space, larger disks, smaller disks.